Whispering and quiet talking use completely different physics. When you speak normally, your vocal cords vibrate two folds of tissue in your throat, oscillating at 100 to 300 cycles per second, producing the fundamental frequency of your voice. When you whisper, your vocal cords do not vibrate at all. They hold partially open a narrowed gap, and air passes through as turbulent flow. The sound you hear during a whisper is turbulence, not vibration, aerodynamically generated noise shaped into speech by the tongue, teeth, and lips. Your voice, the vibrating mechanism that produces every sound you have ever spoken, is off. What remains is airflow through a slot, sculpted into words by the articulators that normally refine the vocal cord signal. Whispering is speech without voice. Physics of that turbulent source, the narrowed gap, the absent vibration, the broadband noise shaped into language produces consequences your throat never advertises. Narrowed gap between your vocal cords during whispering creates a constriction in your airway smaller than the open passage during normal breathing, smaller than the opening during voice speech. Air must be pushed through a tighter space. Your lungs generate more pressure to move an equivalent volume of air through the narrower opening. The resistance is measurable. Your intrathoracic pressure rises during whispered speech compared to identical words spoken in normal voice. Elevated pressure activates your body's automatic pressure regulation. The pressure sensors in your aortic arch detect the increase and trigger a parasympathetic response through the vagus nerve. Heart rate decreases, blood pressure moderates. The mechanism is identical to the one the sigh discussion described for extended exhales. Different vocal cord position. Identical downstream physics. Your whisper is a sustained expiratory resistance exercise disguised as speech, and the disguise has a consequence that deliberate breathing exercises do not share because you are speaking while you whisper. The resistance exercise runs for as long as the conversation or the reading continues. A deliberate breathing exercise requires you to maintain focus on your breath. The moment your attention drifts, the exercise stops. Whispering maintains the airway resistance automatically because the vocal cord position that produces the whisper is also the position that produces the resistance. You cannot whisper without generating the resistance. The breathing exercise is embedded in the speech act. It runs as long as you whisper, whether you are thinking about your breathing or not. Exhale to inhale ratio compounds the effect. Whispered words take roughly 1.5 to 2 times longer to produce than voiced words. The turbulent airflow source carries less acoustic energy than the vocal cord source, so your articulators must work more slowly and your exhales must extend further to produce intelligible speech. You are exhaling longer on every whispered phrase than you would on an identical phrase spoken aloud. The breathing pattern during sustained whispering is exhale dominant by mechanical necessity, and exhale dominant breathing is the respiratory pattern that produces the strongest vagal activation per breath cycle. 60 seconds of whispering produces 60 seconds of extended exhales against elevated airway resistance. No breathing protocol, no counting, no attention to the breath. The vocal cord physics handles the ratio and the resistance simultaneously, while your conscious mind is occupied with the content of what you are saying. A counterintuitive consequence of the turbulent source, whispering uses more air per word than voice speech, not less. Vocal cord vibration is an efficient energy converter. A small volume of air produces a loud, carrier-rich signal. Turbulent flow through an open gap is acoustically wasteful, most of the air passing through without producing useful sound energy. You exhale more air per whispered sentence than per the voiced version. The increased airflow dries the throat faster than sustained talking. The higher volume of air dehydrates the mucosal lining more rapidly. And the increased velocity produces perceptible warmth. Air, accelerated through the narrowed gap by the Venturi principle, generates frictional heating as it passes through your throat. Cup your hand in front of your mouth and whisper a long sentence. The warmth on your palm is more concentrated than the diffuse warmth of a normal exhale. When someone whispers close to your ear, the warmth of the exhale on your skin is part of the sensory experience, a thermal component that voice speech at normal distance does not include. Absent fundamental frequency strips two properties from the signal that voice speech always carries, and both losses have consequences the speaker rarely considers. Voice speech can be directionally located. Your auditory system uses the difference in arrival time between your two ears to compute the direction a sound came from and this computation works best on periodic signals, the repeating waveform of a vibrating voice. Whispered speech cannot be reliably located. Turbulent broadband noise lacks the periodic structure the directional computation requires. A whisper is audible but spatially ambiguous, present in the room but not pinned to a location. Your voice broadcasts your position. Your whisper conceals it. Concealment extends to identity. Every voice sound you make carries a spectral fingerprint, the harmonic pattern produced by the unique shape of your vocal tract, the mass of your vocal cords, the resonant frequencies of your throat and nasal cavity. Voice recognition software identifies you from this pattern. Your family knows your voice from another room because of it. Whispering eliminates the fundamental frequency and every harmonic built on it. The spectral fingerprint disappears. Acoustic analysis of whispered speech cannot reliably identify the speaker. You have experienced this, hearing someone whisper in a dark room and being unable to tell who was speaking until they switched to voiced speech. The lean toward a whisperer is partly auditory need and partly the social processing system seeking proximity to compensate for the identity information the signal does not carry. Anonymity changes what people say. Research on self-disclosure shows that reduced identifiability increases the willingness to share vulnerable or difficult information. Whether the acoustic anonymity of whispering contributes to the intimacy people report during whispered conversations has not been directly tested. The hypothesis is consistent. A whisper delivers content without identity, and the reduction in identifiability may lower the social monitoring that normally constrains disclosure. There is a dimension here that matters specifically if you are over 45, because the mechanism that aging degrades in your voice is the mechanism that whispering does not use. Your vocal cords change with age, the tissue thins, the muscle mass that controls cord tension decreases. The cords lose the elasticity that allowed them to vibrate at the precise frequencies your younger voice produced. The change produces a thinner, breathier, less projecting sound. You may have noticed it. Your voice does not carry across a room the way it did at 30. You clear your throat more often. You strain to be heard in noisy environments. The change is gradual enough that most people attribute it to circumstance rather than anatomy. The restaurant got louder, the phone connection got worse. The restaurant did not get louder, your vocal cords got thinner. Whispering bypasses every component that age degrades. The whisper does not use vocal cord vibration, so cord thinning is irrelevant. The whisper does not depend on cord tension, so muscle loss does not affect it. The whisper does not require the elasticity that produces precise pitch, so the loss of elasticity changes nothing about the whispered signal. A 70-year-old whose voice speech has measurably degraded from age can whisper with the acoustic effectiveness of a 25-year-old, because whispering operates on turbulent airflow through a gap, and the gap does not age the way the vibrating tissue does. Practical consequence: if your voice tires more easily than it used to, whispering is the speech mode that your aging throat can sustain without the strain that voiced speech increasingly imposes. The airway resistance still produces the vagal activation. The articulators still shape the turbulence into language. The bone conduction absence still produces the heightened self-monitoring. Every mechanism described in this discussion operates regardless of what age has done to your vocal cords, because none of them depend on the vocal cords vibrating. Something else changes during those 60 seconds, something you have never experienced during normal speech, and that produces a shift in self-awareness that most people notice on the first attempt but cannot explain. When you speak normally, you hear your voice through two pathways simultaneously. Air conduction, the sound that travels from your mouth through the air to your ears, the version everyone in the room hears. And bone conduction, vibration from your oscillating vocal cords, transmitted through the bones of your skull directly to your inner ear, arriving faster than the air-conducted signal and carrying more low-frequency content. Bone conduction is why your voice sounds deeper and more resonant to you than it sounds to anyone else. You know this. You have heard a recording of your own voice and found it thinner, higher, less substantial than the voice inside your head. The recording is what everyone else hears, air conduction only. The voice you know as yours is air conduction plus bone conduction, a richer, deeper version that only you have ever heard. When you whisper, bone conduction stops. Your vocal cords are not vibrating, so there is no vibration to transmit through the skull. You hear your whisper through air conduction alone, the single pathway, the thinner signal, the version without the bass enhancement your skull normally provides. For the first time in any speaking act, you are hearing your speech the way other people hear it. The shift is subtle, but the brain registers it. Your auditory processing system monitors your own speech output continuously, comparing what it expects to hear with what it actually receives. During normal speech, the expected signal includes the bone-conducted bass. During whispering, the bone-conducted component is absent. The discrepancy between expectation and input produces increased processing demand. Your auditory system is working harder to monitor a signal that does not match its prediction model. The increased processing demand produces increased attention to your own speech. You become more aware of what you are saying, how you are saying it, and the physical sensation of producing it. Most people who whisper for 60 seconds notice this heightened self-awareness without being able to name it. A quality of attention, a sense of hearing yourself more carefully than normal speech permits. The feeling that the words carry more weight when whispered, that each word matters more, that the speech is more deliberate, more considered. The feeling is a consequence of the auditory processing system encountering your voice without the signal it has expected since you first began to speak. Children demonstrate this connection between whispering and cognitive focus without anyone teaching it to them. Watch a child working on a difficult task, a puzzle, a drawing, a construction. Many children whisper to themselves during concentrated effort. The whispering is self-regulation, not communication. The narrowed vocal cord gap producing airway resistance that shifts autonomic tone, the extended exhale slowing the respiratory rate, the absence of bone conduction producing the heightened self-monitoring that sustained attention requires. Developmental psychologists have documented the phenomenon, the transition from voice to whispered to silent self-talk as the child ages, first described as private speech by Vygotsky. The transition is usually interpreted as internalization of language. The physiology suggests a parallel interpretation. The child is using the whisper configuration to regulate their autonomic state during cognitively demanding tasks, and as they mature, the regulation shifts from overt whispering to subvocal processes that maintain some of the vocal cord narrowing without producing audible sound. You may do this yourself without noticing. Mouthing words while reading, subvocalizing during mental arithmetic, moving your lips while concentrating. Each of these involves partial vocal cord narrowing, a trace of the whisper configuration maintained during focused cognition. The respiratory resistance is smaller than during full whispering, but the direction is consistent. Cognitive demand recruits the whisper configuration because the autonomic shift it produces supports sustained attention. That shift from a voice you have known through two pathways your entire life, to a voice arriving through only one, the bone-conducted identity stripped away. The auditory cortex recalibrating in real time to a signal it recognizes as yours, but processes as partially unfamiliar, is the subtraction that rewired how I hear my own voice during every whisper since the bone conduction. Literature named what was missing. Absence of fundamental frequency narrows something else, the emotional bandwidth of the speech. Voiced speech carries emotion through pitch modulation. Rising pitch signals a question. Falling pitch signals certainty. Rapid pitch variation signals excitement or anger. Slow pitch variation signals calm or sadness. These pitch contours are the primary channel through which your voice conveys emotional state to a listener, and whispering eliminates all of them. You cannot shout in a whisper. You cannot convey urgent anger. You cannot produce the rising pitch of surprise or the falling pitch of disappointment. The emotional range compresses to what amplitude and timing alone can carry, which is a narrower range than pitch provides. Whispered speech is emotionally constrained by its physics. The constraint may be part of why whispered conversations feel more intimate and more measured. The medium will not permit the vocal extremes that voice speech allows. The physics imposes a register that emotional discipline alone rarely achieves. And here is where a second question opens, because the airway resistance explains why whispering calms the speaker, and the bone conduction absence explains why whispering changes self-perception. Neither explains why whispering calms the listener. And the listener effect is where the physics produces something no other vocal act replicates. Turbulent airflow through the narrowed vocal cord gap is quiet, 20 to 30 decibels quieter than voice speech at equivalent distance. To be heard, the whisperer must be close to the listener, close enough that the quiet turbulence, reaches the listener's ears above the ambient noise. The physical proximity that whispering requires activates the social engagement circuitry in both participants. Close distance permits detection of facial microexpressions, pupil changes, breath, and the subtle postural adjustments that the social nervous system reads below conscious awareness. Listeners' auditory processing works harder during a whisper than during voice speech, and the reason reveals something about how the brain decodes identity and emotion from sound. Voice speech carries a fundamental frequency, the pitch of the voice. Your auditory system uses that pitch to identify the speaker, to extract emotional tone, to distinguish question from statement, to detect sarcasm, affection, anger, fear. The fundamental frequency is the carrier wave for emotional prosody. Whispering eliminates the carrier wave. The listener's auditory system must extract equivalent emotional and linguistic information from temporal patterns, amplitude changes, and spectral shape alone, a harder computational problem that produces greater auditory engagement and greater attention to the speaker. Combination, close proximity, activating social engagement circuitry, increased auditory processing demand, producing heightened attention, the speaker's extended exhales creating a rhythmic pattern. The listener's respiratory system may entrain too, makes whispering a bilateral parasympathetic event. The speaker's vagal activation through airway resistance and exhale dominance is complemented by the listener's vagal activation through social proximity and focused auditory processing, the shared resonance at intimate distance that the humming discussion described operating through a different acoustic mechanism. Both participants shift toward parasympathetic dominance through different mechanisms operating simultaneously. This bilateral calming explains something the ASMR research has documented from a different direction. Autonomous sensory meridian response, the tingling sensation across the scalp and spine that certain quiet, close proximity sounds trigger, is most reliably produced by whispering. fMRI data published by Lochte and colleagues showed that the brain activation patterns during ASMR overlap with those produced by affiliative physical touch, the neural signature of interpersonal grooming. The whisper may activate a grooming-associated circuit, the auditory system interpreting close proximity, low amplitude, broadband noise as the acoustic signature of physical care. The tingle across the scalp is the somatosensory system responding to an auditory input that the brain classifies as touch. ASMR finding has not been replicated widely enough to be considered established. The field is young, and the individual variation in ASMR susceptibility is large. But the hypothesis is consistent with the physics. The acoustic properties of a whisper low amplitude, broadband spectrum, no fundamental frequency, close proximity source match, the acoustic properties of gentle physical contact heard from intimate distance. Whether the neural response is a true cross-modal activation or a simpler attentional phenomenon has not been resolved. The subjective experience, millions of people reporting physical tingling from whispered audio, is consistent across self-reports, even if the mechanism remains debated. One dimension that surprises most people because the intuition runs in the wrong direction and the correction reveals something about how vocal strain actually works. Whispering is not vocal rest. The intuition says whispering is gentler than speaking, quieter, softer, less demanding on the throat. The physics says otherwise. The muscles that hold your vocal cords in the partially open whispering position must maintain sustained isometric contraction for the duration of the whisper. The muscles that would normally allow the cords to vibrate freely during voice speech are instead held in a fixed postural configuration, not oscillating, not resting, but bracing. The bracing is a different kind of throat muscle work, and for a voice that has been strained by a day of talking, the bracing can produce more muscular fatigue than the oscillation it replaced. True vocal rest is silence, no muscular engagement of the vocal cord muscles at all. Whispering is not silence. Whispering is alternative vocal exercise. The vibratory mechanism stops, the postural mechanism activates. The distinction matters. If you whisper to rest a tired voice, the voice is not resting. The vibration is stopped, but the muscles are working in a different configuration. If your voice is strained from overuse, silence rests it. Whispering exercises it differently. If your voice is not strained, if you have been speaking normally all day and want to shift the vocal demand, switching from voice speech to whispering for 60 seconds provides a specific transition. Oscillatory stress on the vocal cord tissue ceases, postural engagement begins, and the airway resistance mechanism activates the vagal pathway simultaneously. The transition is from vibratory work to postural work, and the postural work carries the parasympathetic activation that vibratory work does not. Bedtime application combines the vocal dimension with the bilateral calming. Whispering to a partner in bed, the quiet conversation that happens after the lights go out, the review of the day, the schedule for tomorrow, the small exchanges that couples maintain before sleep produces the bilateral parasympathetic shift through a mechanism neither of you is aware of. Your extended exhales through the narrowed gap activate the vagal pathway. Your partner's auditory system works harder to decode your whisper in the dark, producing the focused attention and social proximity engagement that shifts their autonomic state towards sleep. Close distance, inches rather than feet, activates the social engagement circuitry in both nervous systems. Both bodies shift towards sleep-compatible autonomic tone through a conversation that neither participant recognizes as a physiological intervention. The bilateral mechanism that operates during bedtime, whispering speaker calming through respiratory resistance while listener calms through auditory focus and proximity, both arriving at parasympathetic dominance through independent pathways triggered by voiceless speech in the dark, is the finding that turned bedtime, whispering from a habit into a dual autonomic intervention for me. One application that combines multiple dimensions, reading text in a whisper rather than silently or aloud. Silent reading activates the visual processing pathway alone. Reading aloud activates visual, motor, and auditory pathways simultaneously, the production effect that triples memory encoding. Reading in a whisper activates the visual pathway, the motor pathway through articulatory movement, and the auditory pathway through air-conducted turbulence. The production effect operates because the motor and auditory encoding channels are active, even though the signal is turbulent rather than voiced. The memory encoding advantage of reading aloud persists during whispered reading because the encoding depends on motor execution and auditory self-monitoring, not on vocal cord vibration specifically. But whispered reading adds the parasympathetic dimension that voiced reading aloud does not provide. The airway resistance through the narrowed gap, the extended exhale ratio, the vagal activation through intrathoracic pressure elevation, these operate during whispered reading but not during voiced reading aloud. Voiced reading activates the speech motor system without the respiratory resistance. Whispered reading activates the speech motor system with the respiratory resistance. The memory benefit arrives through both modes. The autonomic benefit arrives only through whispered mode. Reading difficult or emotionally charged material in a whisper, a medical document, a legal letter, financial instructions, a passage that requires careful comprehension produces triple encoding for memory retention and parasympathetic shifting for emotional regulation simultaneously. The same 60 seconds that encodes the content through 3 channels also calms the nervous system through airway resistance and exhale dominance. The combination is available through no other reading mode. Whisper anything. Read a passage from a book in a whisper. Recite something from memory in a whisper. Describe the room you are sitting in a whisper. Talk through tomorrow's schedule in a whisper. The content does not matter. The vocal cord position matters: the narrowed airway, the turbulent flow, the extended exhale, the absent bone conduction. 60 seconds. Here is what arrives and when, because the dimensions do not activate simultaneously. In the first 10 seconds, you notice the throat. The postural shift in the vocal cord muscles from oscillatory to holding produces a physical awareness of your throat that normal speech does not generate. You feel the narrowed gap. You feel the air moving through it. The sensation is specific and unfamiliar because you have spent decades speaking without ever attending to the vocal cord position that produces the sound. By 15 to 20 seconds, the breathing shift becomes noticeable. Your exhales have lengthened without your decision. The turbulent source requires more airtime per syllable, and your respiratory system has adjusted by extending each exhale and deepening each inhale. If you were speaking at your normal conversational pace a minute ago, you are now speaking measurably slower, not because you chose to slow down, but because the physics of turbulent speech production imposes the pace. By 30 seconds, the self-voice shift registers. The bone-conducted bass is gone, and your auditory processing has begun recalibrating to the air-conducted only signal. The words sound different. Your voice sounds different, thinner, lighter, closer to a stranger's than to yours. The heightened attention to your own speech that the recalibration produces is fully present. You are more aware of what you are saying than you were at the start. By 45 to 60 seconds, the autonomic shift is underway. The accumulated effect of extended exhales against elevated airway resistance has produced enough vagal activation to influence heart rate and respiratory pattern. You may not feel the heart rate change directly. The shift is modest from a single 60-second session. You will feel the breathing, slower, more rhythmic, more regular than it was when you began. The quality of the silence after you stop whispering, the first few seconds of normal breathing, after the narrowed gap opens back to its full width, carries a settled quality that the 60 seconds of turbulent resistance produced. Beyond 60 seconds, if you continue whispering for 3 to 5 minutes, reading a book in a whisper, narrating your thoughts in a whisper, the effects deepen without changing character. The breathing pattern stabilizes further. The heightened self-monitoring from the absent bone conduction settles into a sustained attentional mode that feels qualitatively different from both normal speech and silence. You are present in your own language in a way that voiced speech, with its automatic motor programs, its familiar self-voice, its habitual pacing, does not produce. The unfamiliarity of the whispered voice maintains the attention that familiarity would allow to coast. 5 minutes of sustained whispering is 5 minutes of sustained attention to your own speech. An attentional exercise embedded in a respiratory exercise embedded in a speech act that your conscious mind experiences simply as talking quietly. If another person is nearby and listening, the bilateral effect has been operating throughout your vagal shift through airway resistance, their attentional shift through increased auditory processing of a signal stripped of its fundamental frequency. The proximity the whisper required brought both nervous systems into the social engagement range. Two autonomic systems, shifting toward parasympathetic dominance through different mechanisms triggered by one act of voiceless speech. After 60 seconds of whispering, return to normal voice speech. Say any word aloud. The vibration returns under your fingers. The bone-conducted bass fills your ears. The voice you have known your entire life reassembles itself deeper, richer, more present than the whispered version. The contrast between the whispered voice and the restored voice is sharper than the contrast between speech and silence. You are hearing your own voice return as though someone else turned it back on. The restoration is the proof of what the whisper subtracted, and the subtraction, for 60 seconds, was doing physiological work the restoration does not. Your voice has two modes. One vibrates, one does not. The one that does not eliminates the bone-conducted signal you have heard since you first spoke, extends your exhale into the vagal activation range, increases airway resistance through the narrowed gap between the vocal cords, and produces a sound that the listener's brain processes with greater attention than any normally voiced word you could speak. 60 seconds of voiceless speech. The vocal cords rest from oscillation while the airway works. The exhale extends while the breathing slows. The voice you have known your entire life, the one with the bone-conducted bass, the one only you have ever heard, disappears. What remains is turbulence shaped into words by a mouth that does not need vibration to communicate. Whisper something now. The voice you hear is the voice every other person has always heard when you speak. You are hearing yourself from the outside for the first time.